I'm Mark Henick, nationally syndicated mental health columnist for CBC Radio. I recently had a wonderful conversation with Dr. Dan Tomasulo about compassion. I included a number of clips from that conversation in my radio column, but I wanted to share the entire thing with you here because there's just so much wisdom in it. He was such a lovely person to speak with, and there are so many learnings that I think people can take from it. So, without further ado, here's my conversation with best-selling author Dr. Dan Tomasulo. Can you give us a good definition of what exactly compassion is?
Well, I think it's the way that we care for ourselves and others, and it's our capacity for that. And I think that they're very much related, the degree to which we can care for our well being, because if we can do that well, we can care for others well.
Mm. And how do you think compassion actually works, sort of at the biological level? What's happening in the brain and in the body when people feel compassion?
A couple of different things that seem to be happening. Certainly, there's something about oxytocin, and this is a chemical that really seems to tend and befriend. It means it's about connecting with others. It seems that they started to understand this with mothers and infants right at birth in terms of how it gets activated, how it gets stimulated, how it evolves. And so we've learned over the years that when we're caring for others, this particular hormone gets activated and starts to pump. And, when we care about others, we often say that it warms our heart or something like that. There's a good reason. Seems like the heart has receptors for it. So that's the first part. And the second part, biochemically, is that when we're doing something that seems to fill us up and give us joy or something positive, we're also going to get a little boost of dopamine. So we've got some pretty powerful positive chemicals going
Mhm.
in our direction. Um, but to be fair about it, it's not just about the chemical reaction. It also has to do with intention and desire. Wanting to be in that space.
Well, what does that mean? Can you say more about that?
Yeah, it's like I might be able to have sympathy, let's say, right, and feel bad because somebody's in a terrible predicament. If I read the news about something horrific or terrible, I might get activated, but I might not really be able to do something about it, right? But if I feel something that moves me and then I'm compelled to act. I want to treat that person or myself, if it's self compassion, like I would treat a best friend. Then there's something about my intention. Now I want to do something. And so that's the other part of it. A lot of times, particularly if we read news that's difficult, we might get activated and stimulated, and yet we might not have a lot that we can do about it. So I'm very big on finding some way to channel this feeling. Find some way
Mhm.
where, if you can't give to the person that's in need, can you give it to somebody else almost in a surrogate way?
As I was preparing for our conversation today, I was reading a little bit about attachment and compassion, and I wonder if you feel able to speak a little bit more about this. Do you think is it fair to say that somebody who might have an insecure attachment, especially an avoidant attachment style, and they're not really all that willing, or maybe they're kind of ambivalent about entering into other people's stuff, does that compromise compassion? Do you think?
Oh boy! First of all, I'm so impressed. You have done your homework. Really lovely. If you take a look at sort of standard attachment theory, And it's this basic idea that really only came about, really came into its own in the 1940s, you know, and they started to understand Bowlby's work about the attachment. They wanted to understand, where does love come from? How does it happen between mothers and infants? What happens to the infants that, let's say, get adopted and get different kinds of love? What happens with children who are born into families where love is pretty scarce, or it is episodic rather than regular? And so, just like, you know, once we started to make a science out of that and try to understand if the kind of care that you're getting is ambivalent, meaning that it's there sometimes, not there other times, what gets formed inside of you is sort of like an emotional prototype. And what I mean by that is that if I were to ask you to think about your mother, and you hold her image in your mind, what would happen is your entire body, your emotional well-being, your sense of who she is, would all get activated based on the memories of her, right? If I asked you to imagine your father, a whole different network is likely to come up. If I asked you to imagine siblings, or your partner, your love partner, you would get a different sort of package for each one. So these emotional prototypes are formed based on interactions that we have with people. So if our interactions with people are sometimes good and sometimes not so good, what happens is that we form a readiness to be with them that is a little bit fragile, because we're
Mm.
not sure. So we don't want to go all in because if we jump in 100% and that person isn't there, then we have to sort of back ourselves out. Now, if you multiply that by a series of relationships, and I'm sure you've heard things like, well, she married her father or he married her mother, you know, something along those lines. It seems like that emotional prototype continues in some way. And so it gets stronger. So very often people will come to therapy after they've had a few failed relationships, and then when they step back they say, oh my goodness, I've really married the same person several times. You know, it's they're different, they have different clothes on, different names, different jobs, but it's the same kind of person. So how do you start to understand that? Well, that's what the attachment is. We're not drawn to good or bad, we're drawn to the familiar.
Mm.
So if you have an early experience that's pretty wobbly and you have an insecure relationship, when you go out into the world, um, you are looking for that level of resonance. I want the same thing I'm used to, not necessarily better. Evolution says you'll look for better, but the kind of better might not be exactly better. I'll give you a real quick example. There's a woman I worked with many years ago, that I have permission to talk about this story. And she had three failed marriages, and she was only in her late 30s. And when you looked at each person, they looked incredibly different, right? First one was a carpenter. Second one was a person that had money, but he was a gambler. And the third one was a lawyer, slightly depressed, but very well off. And when we looked at them, I started to share this theory, and I said, you married the same person, and she would have none of it. And one of the things she said is, that can't be. My first husband was a carpenter, so he's banging a hammer all the time, and he was alcoholic. He treated me poorly. When I left him, I was looking for somebody who would treat me better. So the psyche looks for a correction, but the better only had to do with the fact that he wasn't doing something harmful to her,
Mm.
but he had a compulsive disorder, just like the first one. He had a gambling disorder. So he wasn't treating her bad, but when he lost a lot of money, he would get very angry. And then she started to notice the pattern. And then finally, she married a lawyer, and she said, well, this guy didn't drink and didn't have an anger management problem. And I said, well, by your own words, he was chronically depressed. And when he was getting prepared for a trial, he was working over 100 hours a week. So he was emotionally unavailable. So what happens is in each of the instances, she was drawn to somebody with the same compulsion and lack of
Mm,
availability to her, but she was choosing a little bit better each time. It's just that the better also brought with it the familiar.
mm. You mentioned this idea of emotional availability, and that really strikes me because it feels like to me, in order to be compassionate with the suffering of others, to be compassionate with your own suffering, you have to be able to be open emotionally to receiving those signals, to entering into that feeling, rather than to be afraid of that discomfort and suffering. Is that a fair kind of assessment? Do you have to be fairly emotionally available in order to feel deep compassion?
Yeah, and I really love the way that you summarize that because that is particularly true. And what I would add to that is that's also true for self compassion.
Mm,
You see, this idea of having an internal reservoir of compassion that you can extend to others is something that you have to fill up on a regular basis. You know, I teach at Columbia, and I designed the positive psychology courses and run the Spirituality Mind Body Institute. And one of the things I do in the very beginning of the classes is teach the students about self compassion, so that they learn how to treat themselves like they would treat a really good friend. Because what I find is that sometimes people feel very comfortable giving to others, but not so comfortable giving to themselves. So ultimately, what happens if you don't fill up that inner reservoir, you'll eventually get depleted. You'll give out more than you get back. So, learning how to have self care and emotional nurturance, like to really do things that help you feel good about yourself and nurture yourself when how do you lick your own wounds when uh, I don't know if I can say this, when the feces hits the oscillator, when things go bad. How do you take care of yourself, because your own thinking can be your best friend or your worst enemy.
mm. So, what does self compassion then look like in practice out there in the real world?
Well, I'll say it in stages, if you don't mind me responding that way.
Mm,
The first one, which I think is really great, put forth by Kristen Neff, and she was really the person that put this sort of on the map in terms of research and how central it is to learn how to treat yourself like you would treat your best friend. And I think that's such a great framework, because you might do something for your best friend that you give the time of day to for yourself. So just recognizing that you have to do that for you in the same way you might give to others. That's important. The second part, which is much more where I spend my time, I've spent a lifetime doing psychotherapy with people. And what I've learned is that when people are in a tough place, they really don't know how to nurture themselves. So the important thing for the second phase is to learn how to invest in self-care. Then once you recognize that self-care is the way out of not either hurting yourself or others, not getting yourself painted into a negative corner of some kind, not running into a rumination loop of negative thoughts and feelings. But self-care becomes like a mantra. What can I do to take care of myself today? Well, I need to take care of my body, so I'm going to eat better foods. I'm going to take care of my sleep hygiene. I'm going to make sure I get enough sleep so I'm not deprived and not producing the enzymes that help me feel well. I'm going to take care of my health. I'm going to take care of my relationships. There's a great saying in Buddhism: if I take care of this moment, it'll take care of all the others. And I like to extend that to, if you take care of yourself in this moment, that will take care of all the others, because you're constantly finding ways to take care of you. And then that will naturally lead to extension. And the third part, which is a part that I do a lot of work on, has to do with the mechanics of spending time with that part of you that needs to nurture you. I call it the benevolent witness. When we sit and kind of talk to ourselves, about, gee, why did I do that? Or what are they thinking about me? Or anytime you have that sort of inner conversation, the voice that you're talking to could be a very critical or judgmental voice. Oh, geez, you shouldn't have done that. That should have been that. And I am very much after ways to find that part of you that has a benevolence that's not going to respond back where um, it's going to say you're no good or why'd you do that, you hurt people. It's not going to jump on the bandwagon of negativity, but it's going to be an amalgam of all the people who have treated you kind and well that you can call on to start feeling like, oh, there's an inside part of me that I can call on to nurture me. In other words, that self care is going to turn inward in order to get that reservoir filled.
Do you think that if that reservoir is empty, can we learn to be more compassionate, both with ourselves and with others?
You're going to get my favorite answer, Mark, in the whole world, right? Which is it depends. Um,
Mm.
because I'm trained as a psychologist. I've been in that field a long time, and I've trained a lot of therapists. It's a really important thing to understand because most of us find our way into the field, particularly therapy, because of things that we were trying to correct from our family of origin. And so we learn, oh my goodness, if I give to other people, that's going to fill me up. That's going to make me feel great, right? And so we find this way where we're giving to others, but we may be avoiding giving to ourselves. So let's just say if we take a snapshot of that dynamic, giving to others but not nurturing or taking full care of ourselves, the answer is yes, of course you can give to others, right? Without filling yourself up. However, over enough time, there's an inner resentment that builds. And that inner resentment is who's filling me up? I do a lot of consultations for organizations and, hospitals, human service, businesses. If you're giving out more than you're getting back, you'll do fine for a while, but eventually it's like a battery that's not getting recharged. So that's why there's a big movement now toward understanding wellness programs because if you don't have a way of filling up your staff, particularly if you're in the mental health field, oh my goodness. If you're in business, people might allow themselves to give out more than they get back because they're getting paid well, but eventually you'll run into the same depletion. So my point is, yes, you can do that, and you don't want to do that for too long.
Mm. Do you think that there's, hearing you speak about sort of the, I guess, the developmental trajectory of compassion in a way, do you think we become more or less compassionate as we age? Or do we get crustier and kind of more shut down to other people in the world out there as we age?
Well, you're about to get my favorite answer again. It depends.
Sure.
Uh, I will tell you, because my own age now, I've become fascinated with what happens over time. There's something called the positivity effect that you start to see this trend, right? You start to notice that as people age, they seem to soften, right? And they
Mm.
seem to have more positive emotions. And I'll just go back. Of course, some friends of mine did some of this research, which was I thought was fascinating. After COVID, which was you know such a powerful hit, and it was really the first time, mostly because of the internet and social media, that we were able to see kind of like what's happening around the world all at once. But after COVID, they started to do surveys about who got pelted and hit the hardest with this. And so you start looking at the different age groups. So you have like 15 to 25, 25 to 35, all the way up to like, 75, that kind of thing. Well, what they found out is that the younger people took it on the chin. They were brutally hit because they were not allowed to uh, really have the milestones to celebrate. You're missing your high school graduation. You're missing your college graduation. You can't go to your grandparents' funeral. You can't have your wedding. All the things. So it started to hit the young people, and that was really true because now people who were looking for jobs, nobody was hiring. So then you go 25 to 35. So these all got hit. But once you got, 55 to 65 and 65 to 75, people, if you weren't physically overwhelmed by COVID, if you stayed reasonably healthy getting through it, emotionally you did fantastic because you were like, we've had swine flu, we had Nixon as president, we had this, we had that, and they because people had this sense of this is another damn thing. And this, we're going to get through this. And boy, yeah, this is terrible. But I know what it's like to get knocked down and get back up. Whereas younger folks really didn't have a lot in their memory banks about what do you do when that feces hits the oscillator.
Mm. Yeah, and I wonder if there's a generational difference too, because everybody born in the last, 20 plus years is essentially a digital native. And I wonder
Yeah,
how much proximity is required. Getting up close and personal with people is required to feel compassion
sure.
for them in a way that younger generations don't have that, especially in a
Mhm.
context of social media, right?
Absolutely. And again, it's like if you take a look at the World Happiness Report, which every year starts to take a look at trends, and obviously, as you know, screen time is going up. And if you look at that data, it's kind of wild because you see screen time going straight up between eighth and 10th graders, and then what you see is sleep plummeting, and in person social connections plummeting, and happiness plummeting. And that trend has really taken a sharp, sharp vortex. So that the more screen time you have, the more you'll notice that an entire generation and the generation coming is unhappy. So part of it is to learn how do you use social media in a positive way. I think podcast as an example is a great way for people to have access and learn things. Some of the meditation apps, great way to do that. It's just that if we don't do something, the raw amount of screen time looks like in and of itself will have a pretty big setback.
I wonder if people like Steven Pinker have asserted that the world is getting better, that it's less violent than it's ever been before. I don't know whether or not he has a position on whether it's more or less compassionate, but all you have to do is watch the news to feel like the world is not a very compassionate place. What's your view on that? Is the world more or less compassionate than before, and can we make it better?
Oh, that's again. I really kudos to you for your preparedness for this. And I think if you look at Pinker's work or Marty Seligman's work or Barbara Fredrickson, if you take a look at any of the leaders in the field, they've been talking about that things are indeed getting better in terms of things like food distribution, clean water, how people treat each other, those kinds of things. I don't know that those measures, if they were taking within the last month, if they would match what they've said earlier, right? Right, because the news
Mhm.
now is pretty intense and difficult. But I'm actually working on a new book right now where I've gone back to Jung's work, Carl Jung, who was a psychoanalyst in the kind of the turn of last century, and he had a really very deep and particular way of understanding world conflict. And it's only fairly recently that they've published a lot of his works, about 120 20 some odd years that they kept them under wraps because the family wasn't so sure that it was the right thing to let them out. But they did publish them, and they're kind of fascinating. It's called the Red Book, Libra Novus, and then a series called the Black Book series. But what he was saying is that when things are really bad outside, what it's doing is it's stimulating and activating the collective unconscious that human beings are being challenged and shaken, right? So the outside, in many ways, is a projection of what's happening inside. And he began to turn his attention to having a better relationship inside. And now, we come all this way, we have a lot more science behind that process because it seems when we have an inner relationship or a transcendent relationship, it becomes what we call neuroprotective. That your brain actually has a proliferation of neurons in the areas that are usually thinner, causing depression. That's the work of Dr. Lisa Miller. It's like fascinating stuff. So I've really started to take a look at what happens when you have more self compassion, have more of a transcendent relationship where you start getting connected to the part of you that's related to something bigger than you, right? Because you have
Mhm.
to draw on that. So I also study hope, so that's probably a very hopeful way of looking at this. But when I see all the craziness out here, I think it's um, a window into the work that we have to do to develop an inner relationship. And I'll just tell you one thing. It's not published yet, but I will tell you a piece of research. My daughter, who is also in the field, and I did, where we were able to take a look at about 16,000 people worldwide, and we took a look at the relationship between having a sense of self that was positive and the degree to which you believed in world peace. And we were very
Mm.
specific about this. We were studying the what's known as character strengths, and we found out that people who had gratitude, love, kindness, and hope as their inner world were the people who could believe in world peace. And basically, the people who didn't have that inner profile couldn't even envision it. So it's at least from what we're noticing, this is the first time where we're putting a little bit of science based on what's happening inside is reflected on the outside. As above, so below, kind of thing.
Fascinating stuff. I really look forward to that book coming out. I mentioned to you before we started this, I really enjoyed your book, Learned Hopefulness. Haven't read The Positivity Effect, though, yet. Tell us a little bit about that one before I let you go.
Sure, sure. Thank you for asking about it. In the positivity effect, my learned hopefulness came out during the pandemic, and so if you're an author, yeah, I don't recommend you have a book come out during a pandemic. But it was very surprising to
Mine did
myself and
too,
the
actually.
publisher.
It was quite a
Oh, is
journey.
right, right.
Yeah,
It's sort of like, oh my goodness, right? It's like, what's going on here?
yeah.
But because hope was part of it and learned hopefulness was part of it, it enjoyed a rather robust sort of following. People were interested in learning more about the science of hope, and so the second book on that topic, the positivity effect, took a look at four elements that are part of what's called psychological capital. And psychological capital, if you look at, we have financial capital, social capital, human capital, these the things that we're used to. But psychological capital has to do with a person's capacity for hope, empowerment, resilience, and optimism. It cleverly spells out hero. I will, so the acronym HERO helps you remember these four things. But what we've learned is that people who have a high profile on particular these four particular things: hope, empowerment, resilience, and optimism, they do great they do terrific in whatever the situation they're put in, because they have a an emotional resource that lets them get around and through things. There's a there's a beautiful thing in Japanese psychotherapy that's called Morita therapy, based on the founder. And Morita gave metaphors about water for all the situations in life and about therapy. And one of the metaphors he gave was that we should be like a stream that is flowing and comes upon a rock. The stream doesn't stop. It doesn't get frightened. It doesn't. It just simply goes around it and continues to flow. I love that metaphor.
Hmm.
And so when I think about the positivity effect, it's the idea that people who have high hope, high empowerment, resilience, and optimism, when they come upon the rocks in life, the inevitable rocks in life, they have learned how to go around them and move on. So I want therapists to have that. I want businesses to have that, physicians to have that, because I think if people have that kind of resource, they're gonna deal with life on life's terms, but they're going to bring something to the party that people without high positivity effect can't.
That flexibility piece and that sort of fluidity, it really resonates with me. I mean, you mentioned Jung, and actually, I did my undergraduate honors thesis. I attempted anyway to do a Jungian reading of Dante's Inferno.
Oh,
I
of
don't know how
course, of course. Yeah,
successful I
yeah.
was, but
Oh, how
but
great is that?
well,
How
and it
great
was a
is that?
wonderful odyssey because then it's an image that has stuck with me ever since, and I always come back to it.
Sure.
That at the bottom of Dante's conceptualization of hell is ice. Everything is
Yeah.
encased rigidly in ice. What a
Yes.
wonderful metaphor! What a tragic but wonderful metaphor for the depths of
Right.
depression and of self hatred and of being stuck in that
Right.
place. So I really resonate with that image of water.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And you mentioned the word flexibility and this idea. If you look at Dr. George Bonanno's work, the leading researcher on resilience, he's been able to look at what helps people get through trauma, what helps them get through difficult times, what helps them sort of be that flowing river that goes around the rock. And he's identified something called the flexibility mindset. And I really love and appreciate his work, because in many ways that's what we're trying to cultivate. When I would train therapists, and you do clinical supervision, and we don't talk about whatever the problem is and a solution for it. I have them generate at least three different ways to deal with the problem, so that they don't feel like, oh, problem solution, like I have to solve it this way. There's multiple ways to solve problems, and loosening up that mindset to be more flexible seems to be the key to getting through difficult times.
I think that could actually, just to bring us, circle us back to where we started. I think that can actually help us to be more compassionate as well, because I feel like an important part of compassion is sitting with and allowing grace for the imperfections and the suffering of others. And that requires a good deal of flexibility, I think, to not judge people so rigidly all the
Yeah.
time.
There's a kind of a shortcut. I think it came from actually Walter Whitman back in the day. But the correction for judgment is curiosity. And
Mm.
so if you can become curious rather than judgmental, again, that seems to loosen up the soil of your awareness, right? And I think when I do the meditations for self compassion and helping people deal with something uncomfortable, and they're holding a hot feeling or uncomfortable feeling, it's like, get curious about that feeling. Where does it reside in my body? How come it's happening now? um, what are the times I've had this in the past, and when have I moved through it successfully? When you shift to curiosity rather than judgment, you start to approach it in a very, very different way. And so I love what you're saying about the judgment, because I do think we have a bit of an antidote ready. It's just like anything else; it takes some practice.
It does. Well, Dan, I've kept you already for twice as long as I intended to, so thank you for being so flexible with me. I won't keep you any longer, though, but thank you so much for this wonderful conversation.
And thank you for being so prepared. I really appreciated our discussion, and your questions were just magnificent. So thank you.